Test, 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 test. Oh boy. Okay. Wow, that was interesting. All right. Sorry about that, guys. I've never had that happen with this software before. So I just spent the last 15 minutes pulling my hair out. So, all right. Now that we got that off to a nice shaky start, let's get this going. So everybody can hear me okay? Let's start here. And just give me a second to swap my displays. And we should be good to go. All right. All right, hopefully everybody can still hear me. Just somebody let me know one more time, just since I switched the screen, since I had so many little technical difficulties. Again, I really appreciate those hanging in there while I worked out the technical. Good thing I rehearsed this earlier today and it went well, so I could wait for this to have all sorts of issues now. All right. So, okay, so nobody can hear me now again after I've switched over. Oh, Brett? Okay, I'm back. All right. All right, good. Okay, so I'm going to kick this off. Hopefully you guys can hear me because the way I'm running this on different computers here is I can't listen to the audio while I am doing this. Okay, so if I get through a couple of slides and I see that I'm not getting any responses anywhere, I'll assume we have a technical glitch still, and then I'll reschedule it. So, but again, thanks for hanging in there. And let's get moving along here. All right. So just quickly, so tonight going to get through some cyclocross seasonal training and planning. Going to go through a little bit about what cyclocross is about, some of the physiological demands of cyclocross, how to plan it, and then get in a little bit with some key workouts as well. So I know many of you on the call here tonight, but if you don't know who I am and you're not familiar with who Bachworks is, again, we're an endurance sports coaching company. Obviously, we do personalized coaching for cyclists and multi-sport athletes. We also provide professional level bike fitting, performance testing, seasonal training plans, and consultations really designed to fit kind of your needs, right? So very scientific based, analytical based. I like to say we're athlete centric, meaning that our athletes that come on board, we treat them like family. So, and I think some of the athletes that are on board can probably attest to that. Myself, I've been in endurance sports for 30 years. Started out in BMX, mountain bike, got into the triathlon, played some other crazy sports in college, and came back into bike racing for a number of years after some other injuries. So I've been around the sport for a number of years. If you're local, you also know I run a bunch of different seminars and clinics and races, fat bike races, cyclocross races, so a little bit of everything. So pretty wide breadth of things that I've done in the endurance sports world. So keep in mind tonight, really, this is really about my opinion, right? It's based on my gained knowledge over those years and the wisdom I've collected and results of my athlete. But what I'm really trying to get you here is not only listen to your coach, but listen to, for you guys to think for yourself, to take this stuff and kind of get an idea of what to do and what you should be doing for cyclocross. I'm kind of predisposing that people are generally familiar with cyclocross who are on this call. Maybe you have raced a bunch. Maybe you're just interested in racing. So this webinar will kind of fall in the middle. It's not necessarily an intro. It's not super advanced. It'll kind of fall in the middle. So, and again, as far as questions, you can put them in the chat. I'll scan through the chat towards the end of the webinar, okay? So one thing that kind of comes up many times with cyclocross, whether or not you've been doing it for a while or you're brand new to it, is what is cyclocross like? I hear people compare it. Is it like a time trial? Is it like a crit? Is it like a mountain bike race? So what I like to compare it to is these other basic 1 hour events, right? So we have a time trial, like a 40K time trial, usually takes, somebody relatively good fitness about an hour to do. A crit, again, can be about an hour. So all these events here, time trial and crit, 40 to 60 minutes, right? And that's very much like a cyclocross race, 40 to 60 minutes on average, right? And what is similar about these three types of races is that first bullet point where we have this average power and average heart rate. For all three of these, if we look at it when a race is done, they're all about at threshold, right? So if we understand what threshold is, or functional threshold power, if we look at all those again are going to be about the same, okay? But what the difference really ends up being is what we call this variability, okay? So this is really the driving difference between these three. And so what variability is this how smoothly paced an effort was in a race, or like the surges in a race. So you can imagine a cyclocross race has a lot of surges, right? Whether you're running, whether you're coming around a corner, whether you're getting off your bike to go, dismount and remount, very surgy. A crit, you have, the courses and the corners. Where a time trial, very, very steady type of effort. And so we measure this variability based on this scale. And so like a time trial being a 1.0 variability, like you can imagine, you're doing a time trial, very flat, usually, it's usually pretty much a, straight line, not a lot of surging going on in a time trial effort, right? So the intensity is very steady. A crit, on the other hand, again, it could be lots of surges depending on how many corners, depending on if it's got a little hill and stuff in there. So the variability, the smoothness of those efforts tend to be a little bit higher in a criterium, right? So we call it a VI, usually falls with a 1.3, could be up a little 1.5, right? So now cyclocross race can be a much higher variability, right? So we're starting at variability at 1.5, could be up to 1.8 even, right? Or somewhere in between, again, depending on the terrain, depending on the course, and depending on the athlete. Some athletes are going to ride it a little bit different than other ones. So, but that also comes down to this intensity, right? So a criterium, as opposed to cyclocross, very short, high intensity efforts, right? You're coming out of the corner, maybe you're hitting 600, 700, 800 watts in that corner, and then you're settling in doing 0 watts, right? Cyclocross has high intensity as well, but it tends to be less high. So instead of being the 600, 700, 800 watts coming out of the corner, it's 300, 400, 500, maybe 600 watts. Instead of being 10, 15 seconds like a criterium, it's a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, right? Up to these, what we would call like a VO2 max effort, okay? So again, this is kind of just to kind of set your mind a little bit about what the differences are when you're preparing for a cyclocross race. So physiological demands, so that leads us kind of in these physiological demands. So now we understand there's some variability. These surges, these efforts are a little bit different. So cyclocross, if we talk to racers and athletes, when they've done well or when they've lost, that usually it's due to these short, hard efforts, right? Nobody says they lose a cyclocross race during the easy part. Well, I was coasting downhill and I lost a cyclocross race. No, it's these repeated hard efforts. Like it was just one more effort than I could stand, and I popped and I came off, right? So very little tempo, very little of that zone 3 that happens in cyclocross, right? As I mentioned before, extremely variable, right? Courses, terrains, cornering, running is all going to bring that high intensity in there, okay? And again, as opposed to a cyclocross or a criterium, those efforts are longer, but not as high, less intensive, we like to say, but more extensive. So not as high, but longer, okay? And here's the other thing with cyclocross that's important. It doesn't need a huge aerobic base, all right? So it doesn't mean you need to go out and train and do these 4, 5, 6 hour long zone 2 rides to build this aerobic base. However, That aerobic base is supportive. And what I mean by that is it allows the foundation for you to do more high intensity work. So you need to have some aerobic base, but you can get by with a lot less than you would maybe for other disciplines. So something to keep in mind as you're training. Now, I'd like to bring this slide up here and talk a little bit about, before we get into some of the training and some of the prime and key demands of cyclocross, that fitness itself is not created in a silo. So a lot of people hang their hat on like, oh, my threshold and my FTP has to be X number, and the higher the FTP, the better. And that's generally true. But that's not the only thing that comes into racing, and that's not the only thing that comes into being successful with cyclocross. So this is just some ingredients, right, that I have on here. And I could fill up this whole page with another 20 of these. So neuromuscular power, threshold, recovery, muscular endurance, okay? These all go in there. And depending on the time of year, depending on the specificity of the event, and I'll talk a lot more on specificity in a minute, that mixture is going to change. All right, so keep that in mind. It's, you know, there's different things that are going to be important at different times and different stages as you're building up your cyclocross season. Now, I wanted to kind of take a step back a little bit and talk about training zones. And so most people are kind of familiar with training zones, probably to some degree. We have these classic levels: zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. They kind of break into training targets. For those who are like coaches like myself and maybe athletes who are a little bit more on the analytical side, they may have heard of these I levels, which basically take these classic levels and break things up even more. And the reason I bring them up is because we're going to talk a little bit about what we call FRC FTP, which is in that right-hand column, right? This is this cog and I level. And the reason why we have these new levels here is to kind of make them a little bit broader, because now we're taking not only VO2 max, this zone 5 type of efforts, right? This high end of your aerobic capacity, but we're also bringing a little bit of anaerobic capacity and a little bit of threshold. So you see it's kind of a broader way to look at it. And that's going to be one of these key demands, okay? So now when I talk a little bit about this in further slides, you're kind of an idea that how the FRC FTP is a little bit of VO2 max, or a lot of VO2 max, but also a little bit of anaerobic capacity. All right, so the prime physiological demands of cyclocross. So there's really 3 prime physiological demands that we're going to talk about, okay? So again, as I mentioned in that one zone, this FRC FTP, right? So which equates generally to VO2 max. So this is the VO2 max being the cap of your aerobic fitness or your ability. FTP, threshold, right? A lot of people have talked about their functional threshold power. If you're not familiar with FTP or threshold, it's really your ability to hold a particular power, or the highest power you can hold, for approximately an hour, okay? Give or take. Sometimes it's a little bit less than that. Sometimes it's a little bit more of that. But it's really this power that you can hold for an hour without fatiguing, right? And so when your FTP, when you go above your FTP, you fatigue quicker. When you're below it, you fatigue slower, okay? And then, of course, we have muscular endurance. And so muscular endurance is really this ability to maintain power output, right? Turn the big gear, turn the low cadence, high force type of effort. So the combination of those 3 are really, again, those prime ones. It's not the only ones, as I mentioned before with that recipe, but they're the prime ones. So let's jump into these a little bit deeper. All right, so FRC FTP, right? So as I mentioned before, this is usually where riders pop off, right? This is where they get dropped. So this is this time above threshold. And let me also mention FRC, since I'm mentioning this, you guys are wondering what's FRC stand for. So FRC stands for functional reserve capacity. So this is the amount of work that you can do in kilojoules, so kilojoules being energy, above your threshold. So every rider, athlete has a certain amount of energy they can do above threshold before they empty that tank. So in many ways, you can look at it as it's a tank. And how are you going to spend that tank is depending on how hard you go. So you have a certain amount of energy, you go very hard, you burn it up, you spend it a little bit more wisely, and maybe you burn through it a little bit slower. But generally, we're looking at efforts at 105% and above your threshold, okay? But this also comes back to, again, not only those efforts, but that specificity that needs to be done. So if we're looking at this and we're thinking about what do we need to do to prepare for cyclocross, well, we need to do some of that zone 5 work. Okay, we need to get some of that work above threshold in to be able to be prepared. And I see a note that we have no audio. So if you guys can hear me, let me know. Okay, thank you. And so how do we measure this? So we measure it usually by 5-minute maximal test. So you want to go out and you want to get an idea of what your FRC, FTP, VO2 max is. A 5-minute maximal test will give you a pretty good ballpark estimate of what your VO2 max is. Now, is it going to be 100%? Maybe not, but it'll be pretty darn close. I've seen enough research, I've seen enough data to know that 5-minute test is pretty close. So if you want to go out and do it, you do a 5-minute test, fully recover, do another 5-minute test. They'll give you a pretty good idea where you are. And then you could periodically do that type of test during your season to see whether or not you're gaining fitness in that particular demand. All right, FTP, functional threshold power. So as I said, it's a little bit less important, and I'm going to talk a bit about how FRC and FTP play together as you build fitness. It is still kind of the standard performance indicator. It's still better to have an FTP that's higher than lower. Generally means if you have an FTP, you're racing against a guy or a gal who has an FTP of 300 and you have an FTP of 200, more than likely they're going to be able to put out higher watts through the whole race, be able to recover faster, and be able to put out a little more speed. So again, it's not the only thing that's important, but it's still, still one of the key primary things that we need here. And again, FTP is primarily those zone 4 threshold work that happens between 90 to 105% of your FTP, okay? And FTP is also important because it helps us maintain and recover from effort. So if we also think a little bit more about like how a race goes for cyclocross, it's usually going hard, and it doesn't always then become easy. Like a criterium, sometimes we play a game in a criterium of 0 watts where we're going very hard and then we're doing no work. Cyclocross could be you're going very hard, but then you're only easing up a little bit. So instead of dropping down to zone 2 or zone 1, and as I said before, there's no tempo, there's no zone 3 type of work in cyclocross. Maybe you're only dropping down to threshold. And so now you're at threshold for a very long period of time, and then you're back up above threshold, and then you're back down below threshold. It's a lot what's happening within a cyclocross race, okay? So, and as I mentioned, there's this relationship between FRC, VO2 max, and FTP, which means that as you increase sometimes this high-end power, you will sometimes sacrifice the FTP. But that does not mean that you should not train it. So again, you need to train it. Now, I'm not going to get into different ways to do FTP tests. There's all sorts of ways you can go out there and do your FTP test. I tend to believe the longer the test, the better. But it doesn't matter to me if it's a 20-minute test, a 30-minute test, or a 40-minute test. Just whatever test that you use, just make sure it's repeatable. So you do a test and it's outside on a 10-mile time trial. Okay, can you do that 10-mile time trial again if you need to retest it in the middle of October, or the weather's going to be so crappy that you can't get out and do it. So have some repeatability to that test. That's the main thing I'll tell you. Now, muscular endurance, as I mentioned before, this is that ability to have repeat those very hard efforts, okay? So we know legs, we're going to be turning low cadence, high force, legs are going to fatigue. Just riding on grass alone compared to asphalt, I mean, it's a no-brainer, right? How much harder it is to turn the crank arms when you're riding across a varied surface like that. But muscular endurance, building this in, is going to help you maintain power for the whole race, okay? And it's also going to give you less fatigue towards the end of the race, right? So maybe some moves are happening towards the end of the race. You need to close the gap. You need to ride up those hills. Building the muscular endurance in there is going to pay off towards the end of that race. Now, I added this chart in here because I mentioned a couple of times previously about this relationship of this functional reserve capacity to FTP. But here's a good indicator. So we have FRC in the green. We have FTP, or we say called model FTP, if anybody's wondering what the MFTP is. at the bottom. And we can see as we start getting into the cyclocross season here, in this case, starts pretty early, there's quite a boost in FRC. So we're seeing that work, that anaerobic work that this athlete is doing to bring that FRC up, okay? And that FRC actually stays up for quite a bit of time. I don't have the date where it drops down, but if you can look towards the end of that, that's, you know, we're getting in December. So this is pretty much in late August through November type of cyclocross season that we see here in the Northeast. But what we're also seeing on the orange line below is this little bit of dip of FTP, all right? Not a huge dip because this athlete is still doing what they need to do, right? And again, why are we seeing this change? Because of specificity, right? Those three primary demands, those three key demands that I mentioned, the ability to do those hard, repeated efforts, and the ability to do those and recover, and the ability to do those and not get popped off the back, all right? All right, so that kind of covers a little bit. I know it's kind of a quick intro of what those physiological demands are. But it's kind of enough, hopefully, to get you thinking a little bit about what you need to do in your training. So let's move on a little bit to planning the season, all right? So now we know those demands. How do we plan this? How do we start to put this together, right? So I like to break this up into 3 steps. First, I'm going to look at the event demands, right? What do I need to do to get ready for cyclocross? What are the specific, in general, event demands? What are the athlete abilities? And scheduling periodization. All right. So when are my events occurring? Are they, you know, are my A races happening really early in the season? Are they happening late in the season? Or are they even, you know, super late or beginning of next year? Or sometimes the cross calendar can go that way depending on where you are in the country. And so really that point 1 and 2 kind of falls into what we call a needs analysis, right? So this is really the equation for planning, and it's pretty simple, right? We look at the demands of an event. We can have general event demands, these specific event demands, and stuff may not always kind of cleanly fall into these boxes, but it could be, for example, a general event demand could be something as simple as like, all right, well, I need to have a cyclocross bike, and it needs to have certain tires on it, all right? Specific event demands could be, well, again, I need to have that high FRC, FTP. I need to work on my threshold. I need to work on my muscular endurance. It could be skills work too, right? So these are some of the event demands, right? And then also the other side of that is the ability of the athlete. So, you know, what are your strengths and weaknesses? What do you need to work on? You know, are you a good sprinter, but, you know, you don't really have the ability to stick very long? Are you, you know, have really, you know, again, go back to the skill stuff where, you know, you've not touched your bike in a while, and you need to work on this on that as a weakness. So skills can certainly be a weakness, but also can be a weakness on the physiological side. And again, this kind of goes into this needs assessment, right? So going back a little bit, reviewing some of the things I said earlier about cyclocross. So cyclocross events average about 40 minutes in length, depending on what category you're in. Can be a little bit longer. I know some people do 2 races in a row, but you really can get by with training less, but it has to be quality over quantity, okay? You can have a good cyclocross season on 6 to 8 hours. If you're racing pro, obviously you're going to be doing a little bit more, but again, if you're doing these high intensity workouts, you're also not going to be able to do a ton of those during a week. So you're not going to go out and do a whole bunch of VO2 max sessions every day and get 10, 12 hours of those in. Your body's just not going to support it, right? Especially, you know, if you're just an average amateur racer, you're not going to be able to support that. So higher intensity, a little bit less that you need to do as far as hours, okay? So less emphasis on those long rides, less emphasis on saying I need to do those 4, 5, 6 hour rides, more on the specificity of the event, okay? And this predisposes, again, that you have some base fitness already, all right? Because we're already, for some people, in the ability. So, yes, Casey, 6 to 8 hours a week, okay? It can be more, but you can get by and have a good cyclocross season on that little, providing that that it's quality and not quantity, okay? You could do more zone 2 work, but it isn't going to really buy you anything, okay? You also need to really take that self-assessment, especially if you're coming off a season. Are you recovered? Are you mentally and physically fit? And have you worked on bike skills? If you haven't touched that cyclocross bike since last season, you probably need to get out there and kick off the rust and get on it, okay? All right. So periodization really is just kind of a plan. There's lots of different ways you can slice and dice a season. This is kind of just a linear approach to periodization to think about where you need to be from your race, okay? So we tend to break things up into these mesocycles and microcycles that I'll talk about in a second. But we usually have base, and again, this is not hard and fast rule. This depends on the athlete. Base tends to be about 12 weeks. Build tends to be about 8 weeks. And race tends to be about 4 weeks, but I've seen it extended 8, 12 weeks, okay, with some recharge in there on the race, right? And the difference becomes through these cycles here, this periodization, the type of training you're doing and the specificity, all right? So, for example, as we start moving towards race and thinking again about those demands that I mentioned earlier, base is still going to be some high volume, all right? You're still going to have that type of work in there. You're going to have SST is sweet spot work. You're going to have some sweet spot work. This is work that is just below threshold with the idea of if I work just below threshold, maybe 88%, 89% below threshold, I can help raise my threshold by lifting it up. Of course, big gear work for the muscular endurance type of stuff, being able to turn, those crank arms over when it's a low RPM, and you're climbing up hills. And here's the other thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about running, and I'm sure the triathletes that are on there are cheering with the running, and the cyclists on there are like, I'm not going to run, but it's a time to begin your run work, okay? So, and you do need to have some run work in there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is your opportunity to start doing it now and doing it easy enough if you've not done any run work that you can do it without injuring yourself, okay? From there, we move into that build phase. So we're going to start again. Now we're bringing that higher intensity up. We're going to start working on that FRC, FTP, that VO2 max, that zone 5 work, okay? We're going to start bringing some sprint work into it as well. Those could be standing starts. Cyclocross, if those who do it know that the sprint begins in the beginning. So if you're new to cyclocross, that's going to be something that's going to be new to you. Understand that sprint is really important in the beginning for where you're placing yourself early on in the race, okay? And now your run, if we start thinking about the runs that you do in cyclocross, they're short, right? But they're high intensity. So they could only be a couple of seconds, but you're off that bike, you're sprinting hard, and you're back on that bike. So now if you've begun that run work previously, now you're able to maybe start adding in a little bit more high intensity on the runs. And you can mix that in, okay? None of these workouts need to be done, or none of these efforts need to be done in a silo. So you can mix and match type of stuff. You can have a sprint workout that incorporates some run and incorporates some skill work, okay? And then there again, we're gonna move into the race season. And what happens in the race season is you're racing on Saturday and Sunday. So that's kind of taking care of some of the higher intensity type of stuff. So you don't need to do a ton now because you're already in the race season, you're racing and you're recovering. But the other things you can start to do is you can work on kind of the higher end of stuff as well during the week, which is what we call FRC or PMAX. So PMAX is basically this maximal, very short effort, like a sprint. So you can incorporate that in. And here's the good news for those who don't want running. Less running once you get into the race season. So running will kind of take care of itself once it's in the race season, okay? So a typical week could look like something like this. Again, you're racing Saturday and Sunday, maybe Monday's a rest day, Tuesday could be a high intensity day, or even Wednesday could be a high intensity day, and then you got Thursday as an easy day, and then Friday is an opener. So you have potentially 3 high intensity days already kind of baked in there, right? So you need to have the recovery days in there. I like to say that any of the training that you do and workouts that you do, that's just a stimulus for you to get better. You have to be able to recover. That's when the adaptation happens. So it's important, especially once we get into race, and especially here in Central New York, where the race season now starts in, at the end of August, and it goes almost all the way to December. And for people who are traveling around the country, your season's even longer. So you got to keep that in mind. Like, how am I going to be able to do that if I'm just doing high intensity stuff all the time? So keep that in mind. I like to put this in there because if many of you on the call have been already out riding, you've been racing your bike, or you're a triathlete, you've kind of done some of this already, okay? So, you just finish up the season, and, you got a lot of the base probably already in. And if you're thinking about racing and doing well in these early season races, you got to start kind of keeping your eyes on the prize. What I mean by that is maybe you have a couple of races coming up this month or next month, but cyclocross is the main gig that you want to get ready for. So you may have to kind of rethink what your priorities are, right? We're going to talk a little bit about prioritizing races A, B, and C in a minute, but you may need to sacrifice that going super deep on that long gravel race because you want to be ready for the cyclocross race, okay? So you need to determine if those races that you're doing now are training or they're races. And again, this goes back to being able to recover. We like to use a term, and some of you have heard it, where you have a certain amount of matches to burn during a season, and even during an event to some level. And how hard and how deep and how many A races can you possibly do? It's nice to say every race, and like, for example, I'm going to do 10 cyclocross races and they're all A races. It's not going to be possible. Like, you're going to do some of those well and you're going to do some of those poorly, or you may end up doing them all poorly because you planned it that way. So that's what I mean by you only have so many matches. And if cross is your main focus coming up, and you still have some races and events that are coming now through July and August, you may want to rethink about how you're racing those. I'm not saying not to go hard, but accommodate for how you're doing those. So you're making that part of maybe that build, or maybe the end of that base phase or that early build phase, okay? All right, so as I mentioned, plot out your events and prioritize those, all right? It's really gonna start with an A, B, and C. And what I mean by that is A are your priority events. So maybe that's, one of the races, a UCI race or some other big race, that's your A race, right? So you're gonna start planning from there and working your way back, right? So that A race is in the middle of October, and now I'm gonna start counting back how many weeks back do I need to be to get all these other phases in, and considering where I'm at as an athlete, okay? But then we're also going to have some of these other races that are sprinkled in, or events, these B and the C. So B are kind of tune-up sharpening races. C, I consider those basically just stuff to get experience, just to knock the rust off. For many of us, the first race of the season is not our A race. Maybe it is for you for some of you. But for the most part, it's usually not. Those will be our C races, and then we got a few Bs, and then we work to 1 or 2 As, okay? Once you get into planning these, whether or not you're following the guidelines that I mentioned or you're using your own, I recommend you do a 3 to 4 week microcycle. So what I mean is, during that, if you think of the 12 weeks like in base, or that's not just going to be continually building every week. We're going to do 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and then you're going to have a recovery week, okay? Again, I'm not here to debate different periodization methods. Generally, a linear periodization kind of methodology tends to work for most people. It kind of tends to work well for the seasons and where we are here in the Northeast, okay? But again, focus on those physiological demands, and then increase intensity as you go forward into your season. For many of you, unless depending on what tools you're using, I always recommend when you're doing this planning stuff that you use a spreadsheet. Like, if you don't have access to all the analytical tools a coach has, spreadsheet is a phenomenal way to do it, okay? This is not my spreadsheet. I use something similar to this, and I like this one because it has a ton of information on how things were broken up. This is not necessarily a cyclocross calendar, but it's good to kind of look at how these base phases, okay? This is a little bit of a longer base phase than I mentioned, but you can see how things are going from general to more event specific, tackling that weakness, which is the limiter, right? It was as they get into build phase. You could even do that a little bit earlier in the base phase. And then until we get into what they call intensive, which is really the race phase, okay? And so you start these type of things by listing those events, A, B, or C priority, and starting backwards from, to today. How much time do you have, right? That race is in September. You don't have a hell of a lot of time, right? If it's in October, November, you got some time to build stuff. Again, considering where you are with your training right now. If you've not touched the bike at all, you've not done anything, you need to get moving. If you've had a full season already, maybe you're recharging right now and you're getting ready to tackle some of this stuff, okay? But also, like I said, list your limiters, your strengths in some of the event demands, right? So what are some of the event demands? As I mentioned, muscular endurance, right? So that's one of the event demands, okay? Skills work, again, that's an event demand. It's not a physiological demand, but it's certainly an event demand. Which, lo and behold, leads us into talking a little bit about skills. So I have seen many, many times people who lack fitness kick ass on a cyclocross course because they have great skills, okay? So cyclocross is not just about pure power. You need to have the skills as well to do good in cyclocross, okay? I estimate, and again, this is my estimation, that poor cornering can cost you a second per turn. And if we think about a cyclocross course, and I know the majority of you on the call have done cyclocross, there's a lot of turns in cyclocross, right? There's a ton of them, all right? And imagine how that adds up. That's minutes per lap that you can lose if you don't know how to corner effectively and you don't know how to corner through varied terrain. Can you corner on sand? Can you corner on mud? Can you corner if it's an off-camber turn? These are things to work on, okay? Poor starts. That's something usually you see with new riders, new racers, and people coming to cyclocross. They either don't realize that there's a sprint in the beginning or they don't want to be part of the sprint in the beginning, okay? So what happens if you don't get a good start in cyclocross and you're not one of those front 2, 3, 4, gals or guys in the beginning is you're going to have to make up that spot somewhere. And usually in the first couple 100 meters, there's something technical, a turn, a twist, a barrier, and it bottlenecks. And if you get caught behind that bottleneck, you got a lot of work to do to get around that. So positioning yourself, working on those starts, that is a skill. Can you clip in at a start without looking at your feet? That's something when I coach junior athletes, that's one of the first things I check. Can you clip in and start without looking down at your feet? Because if you clip in, you're looking at your feet, where's your handlebars go? They go to the left or to the right, right? You move into somebody, you don't get a good start. You can pedal without clipping in. So practice that. What happens if I go to do a start and I'm not clipped in? You can still pedal like mad, okay? And then clip in as soon as you kind of get into position, okay? This skills work is going to build that confidence and familiarity with the efforts that you have, right? So like you're not used to riding, you're not good riding in the sand, go practice it. Find a spot, go over to the beach, find a location that has sand, practice it again and again and again, okay? Practice 10, 20, 30 repetitions of those. Make a mock course in your local park. You can go pick up tape pretty cheap at Lowe's or Home Depot and make just a couple of turns, okay? But skills, super important, really part of the equation. And then the other side of the thing, as I mentioned, there's people that can do really well that lack the fitness and have skills. You can have this. You also can have that big engine. So you need to balance it out. All right. So these are just some skills you can incorporate into any workout, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some different key workouts in a moment. But mounts and dismounts, of course. Here's the thing with the mounts and dismounts and the barriers. Usually most races, you're going to do a mount and dismount maybe 4 times, 6 times, 8 times at the most. And so people get very nervous and very concerned about working on that skill. You're going to do a lot more cornering than you are going to do mounts and dismounts, or you're going to go over barriers, okay? Depending again on the course. So certainly spend time on it, certainly get fluid at it, but don't panic about it because it is a very small part of your race day, okay? But other things you work on is suitcasing, shouldering. These are ways of carrying your bike properly, doing off-camber stuff, especially off-camber turns. You ever want to do an off-camber turn going down a hill? It can be interesting the first time you do it and understanding how to do it. So, of course, I said cornering, and then depending on how serious that you take cyclocross, maybe practice some of those bacon and beer hand-ups, okay? I don't necessarily recommend that you jump flaming pallets on your fat bike. But I love this picture. I would add it to my race if USA Cycling would permit that, but I don't think I'd get the insurance for it. So we'll have to wait, maybe under NACS. All right. So coming back to running, I think I kind of talked a little bit enough about this. Do you need to run? Yeah, you need to run. Yeah, you need to do it early. Yeah, you can work in the skills and drills, but I really want to just touch on that last bullet point. It's really to protect you against burning a match and injury. That's really why I want to see riders and athletes work some running into it, okay? And what I mean by that is, like, if you ever, in a cyclocross race, you get off your bike and you run that small distance, you get back on, your heart rate tends to skyrocket. And it's even worse if you've not practiced it. So doing that in practice, doing that in training is going to help you and help your body get used to that type of effort, okay? And then also, so you don't pull a hammy, right? And depending on some of the courses around here, for those that are local that are on the call, Cyclocross, right? How muddy was that last year, right? Super, super muddy. It turned into 3/4 of that race was running, so you may do more running than you realize, and it's good to be prepared for that if you have to, right? So you have that in your quiver. Now, mental toughness is something, I'm not going to get a ton into mental toughness, but here's the thing. Cross is effing tough, right? There's no doubts about it, right? You pick the sport that's hard. You want to pick something easy, then we'd say, I tell people go bowling, right? So, and it's, hopefully there's no bowlers on it. I get pissed at me for saying that, but cross is a tough sport, right? So those who know Bonkworks know I kind of have this mantra about feeding the wolf, right? There's a story that goes, and there's the good and the bad wolf, and which one are you going to feed? So the bad wolf is kind of all these negative thoughts that come in your mind. Good wolf is all these positive thoughts that come in your mind. So what I really want to get across is there's no advantage for you to go on race day, be lined up, looking left and right, and say, everybody here is going to kick my ass. Because you know what's going to happen? They are going to kick your ass. You better go with a positive mindset and think, you know what? I'm gonna have fun. I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to go out here and I'm going to try to win. And so you don't win. But you know what? You still got further along than you would have just lining up and saying that you were going to get your butt kicked, okay? And that's a skill. And that's a demand. So you have to practice that skill. And that's why I put in, take some time to quiet the mind. So, whether it's before your workouts, it's a good time to start building that into practice. Take 5 minutes before your workout, 5 minutes before your race if you can, and quiet your mind and focus on your breathing. Because you know what? I hear that breathing is important, right? That we can't live without breathing, right? No brainer, right? We need to be able to breathe. So just bringing it back to focus a little bit on that breathing, quiet the mind, okay? And then some of the other tips and tricks I like to give my athletes is, like, what is your job today? Like, if they're really nervous, like, what's your job today at the race? All right, it's not necessarily to go and win, right? Maybe it is to have fun. That can be part of it. But your job can be something simply as, it is to go as fast as I can from point A to point B. It's go as fast as I can for 40 minutes. So when you're in that pain cave and you're suffering and you're bleeding out the eyeballs during that race, this is the time to go back to that breathing, and it's time to go back to what your job is today, because you're not going to be able to think much. And the body and the mind starts to kind of go on autopilot to some degree, and you start stressing out like, oh, this really hurts, right? As I said, cross is effing tough, right? So these are kind of the skill sets to work on during race day, or work on during training, and then you can incorporate them at race day, okay? But unless you're getting paid for this, focus on fun. Even if you are getting paid for it, hopefully you're still doing it for fun and while you're doing it, but it's fun. Most of the racing here in the Northeast is very grassroots. Make sure you thank your local race promoter, because it's a thankless job, as I know, cough, cough, right? So, but focus on having fun. That's what's great about cyclocross. It really brings this element, this community element into it. All right. So quickly, I'm going to touch on a couple of example cross workouts. I know we're going a little bit later here because I got this late start thanks to the microphone issues, but I'll go through these kind of quickly. And here's the thing. If you email me, coach@bonkworks, BONKWERX.com, and I'll have it at the end, I'll send you these workouts if you want to give them a try. But let's kind of go through those and talk about how they're used. So first one I call cross crushers, all right? So this is really designed to target that FTP development and muscular endurance. As I mentioned before, you can do these workouts and do some of these elements, these primary demands together, right? This workout is really designed to develop that power at that low cadence, right? You're not going to probably be spinning along at 90, 100 RPMs at most cyclocross races. That was tough to get out. And be able to do those hard accelerations at that low cadence, okay? So this is pretty simple. Most of my warm-ups for most of my clients are pretty similar. Usually you have some warm-up that's 10 to 15 minutes in length, sometimes longer depending on the intensity. You just really want to kind of work your way up and make sure the body is ready to go. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining the warm-ups. But this workout really is a workout being done in zone 5 for a minute. And then you're going to go right into a big gear work at sweet spot. So we start in zone 5 for a minute, and then so we got kind of that burst, that hard effort, and then we're settling into this sweet spot just below threshold, okay? So the main thing with these type of workouts is because you're doing very low cadence, if you have any knee pain doing those, then stop, okay? So by no means am I telling you to do these. If you have knee pain, like, oh, I saw it on this webinar for Bonkworks and he said to do it and I'd be better at cross and I blew out my knees. No, if you get knee pain, be smart, okay? Be your own advocate, okay? If you want to simulate these like a cross race, you can do these from a standing start, right? So have that 1 foot clipped in, practice that clip in, practice that sprint 1 minute, go hard, and then settle into this big gear effort, okay, for about 6 minutes. And if you can't do 6 minutes, start at 4 minutes and then work your way up to 6 minutes. And once you hit 6 minutes, then progress it up to 8 minutes, okay? Everything you should think about progressing the duration a little bit. All right, cross edges. So this again steps it up a little bit. So this is going to be targeting some of that FTP and FRC, VO2 max type of work, targeting your aerobic power, anaerobic endurance, okay? Again, not going to talk too much about warm-up. Lots of different warm-up protocols. This one I have a few sprints that I usually have them, my athletes incorporate to make sure that they are properly warmed up, because this is a little bit more, on high intensity. But an edge workout usually means that it is at the edge of a particular zone. So that's where the word edge comes from, right? So this is on the edge of that zone. So pretending, wherever your zone 5 falls, this is the end, the power that's at the edge of it, okay? So you're going to do that for 90 seconds. So it's going to be very hard effort for 90 seconds, okay? Recover for 5 minutes, and then you can progress that up. So you do that a couple of times, feels good, add a few more sets in, okay? And now a good way to simulate this, like a cross race, is by starting by doing a dismount and a remount, and then immediately in the effort. So you come through a barrier practice, or you're simulating a barrier, and then you're going to go really hard for 90 seconds, and then you're going to recover, okay? And then you could loop back around, take 5 minutes of loop down, cool down a little bit, boom, do it again. Go over the barriers, bury it for 90 seconds, and then recover. All right, microburst, again, stepping this up a little bit. And as I talked about, like getting into that race part of the periodization cycle, we're going to target some of this maximal neuromuscular power, which is usually what we would call sprinting, okay? These are these very short 10, 15-second efforts. So again, won't talk too much on the warm-up stuff, but these are 3 by 10 minute, actually let's just say 10 second, 3 by 10 minutes, but it's continuously 15 seconds on and 15 seconds off. So you're gonna go 15 seconds as hard as you can, that's the burst, recover for 15 seconds, do it again, okay? Maybe 10 minutes is more than you can handle right now. So again, nobody says you have to do 10 minutes. Start with 5 minutes, then work your way up, okay? But again, this is gonna really help develop those hard, repeatable accelerations that I have on there. So somebody's going really hard coming out of a corner and then recovering and then going hard, okay? So as I mentioned here, simulating like a cross race, you can do these on a corner or a hill. You set up a little mock course. Every time you're coming out of that corner, you're going to sprint hard for 15 seconds, recover, loop around, again, another 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, and continue those, okay? They're hard, okay? You don't need to do a lot of them. right? You don't need to do an hour of those of continuous. You know, your whole workout can be an hour, but you don't need to do an hour of microbursts to see the benefit of those. Okay, so again, in that race phase, maybe this is the Tuesday or Wednesday of the week to keep the fire lit in that engine. Okay. All right, running, 30-30s on running. So this is going to simulate running efforts, mounts and dismounts. Basically starts with a threshold effort, and then you're going to do 30 seconds of run, or where you could carry or push your bike, and then you're going to hop back on the bike, pedal at high cadence, and then do it again. So people are kind of familiar with the term 30-30s, doing a 30-second full on and 30-second off, while you're doing kind of the same thing, but you're jumping off and running, pushing, carrying your bike. Okay, so same type of thing. This is this is not something you're going to do in that early base phase, something you're going to do in that build phase. And again, why do we do it? Specificity, right? So this is going to simulate those efforts, like, you know, you come over to barrier, or maybe it's a hill you got to run up, so the body is ready and used to it. So, and why I didn't talk about cool down or any of these, cool down is really important. Okay, you're going to build lactic acid. What happens with that when you do a cool down is you're going to convert that lactic acid back into energy. Okay, you're going to flush out the legs. So don't skip your cool down. Really important. All right. So with that is the end of the presentation. If you have questions, you can go ahead and shoot them in the chat. I'll try to scroll back through the chat and see if I missed anything. Again, I apologize for the audio stuff. Really frustrating, especially once I test this stuff many times ahead of times. But you know, it is the world we live in, technology world that we live in. So hopefully, the majority of you hung in there, and I appreciate that. So. You're welcome, Casey. Celia, good to have you on there. And again, as I mentioned before, if you don't have questions right now and you want to email over to me, feel free to do that at coach@bachworks.com. I hope that this was good for everybody and it was informative. You guys all came away with learning a little bit of something. Give another minute here or two for questions. All right. Well, thanks again. I'm going to wrap up the broadcast, and feel free to email me if you have any questions. Hopefully, I'll have to edit out the beginning with the audio issues, but this should post up so you can review it and watch it in the future. All right. So make sure that you check out some of the other webinars I'm going to do. We have one with Run Power coming up. I know Coach Matt is going to have a few this fall as well. If you have any webinars or topics you want us to kind of investigate and present on, feel free to shoot those over. And also mention, if you are interested in any bike fits or coaching, we do have a few open spots, especially for cyclocross. We're getting in that season. Hint, hint, right? What we're talking about. So feel free to shoot me an email, and we can do just a chat to see whether or not what we do for coaching fits for you. All right. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you again, everybody. Have a nice evening.